But Heather's right. We don't necessarily have to be in a really, really terrible time for us to start building the habit of taking care of ourselves, because it is in the terrible moments when we most need it. And those are also the moments where we tend to forget about it. So starting to build the case for why it's important is what we're going to try to accomplish today. And just by way of an introduction, so I'm a family physician, board certified in integrative medicine, which is a combination of traditional medicine and non-traditional medicine, board certified, and functional medicine. So my approach to healthcare and medicine is completely different from what you would expect in a traditional medical visit. Our company focuses on longer visits. We are completely telemedicine, so we can see you at your office, your startup, your home, your basement, your bunker, wherever you're hiding out. And so you'll find as we go through this presentation, I tend to have a very holistic view of how people are. And I am also an intense geek. So you're going to get some solid physiology out of this, which then you can go, your friends and family and, really talk about how much you understand now how stress actually works in the body and when it doesn't work. So in terms of what we're going to be learning, as I mentioned, the physiology of stress, because it's just so fascinating how stress works in the body and why it is a really incredibly important part of protecting us from our environment and from the things that might cause us harm. So it is a necessary, quote unquote, evil, but we have to learn how to wrangle it. And when it goes awry, we want to be able to evaluate and recognize those harmful patterns of stress and get on top of those things so that they don't become long-standing health problems. And then when I originally wrote the agenda for this webinar, I was talking about one simple technique that we could do, we savvy women, business owners and moms and other titles that we have to do self-care. But what I realized was that I think that there's more than just one approach. What I didn't want to do was ladle onto you a lot more to do. That's one of the things I really hate about self-care is it just feels like more to do, like more things I actually have to do. So I try to incorporate really, really, really simple things that do not take energy, do not take time, do not take money, do not take away from anything, but hopefully are value added to your day. So let's talk about what stress is. So if you look it up in the dictionary, you get this noun, basically. Stress is a noun. It's a state of mental or emotional strain resulting from adverse or very demanding circumstances. That sounds very dry and very clinical. And most of us are like, no, it's much, much worse than that. That can't possibly be the definition of stress. I think the strain part really speaks to us. We understand that it does cause a strain. Sometimes we feel it in our minds, like distraction, depression, anxiety. Sometimes we feel it in our bodies, like neck tension, back tension, grinding our teeth, tight jaw. But I think all of us have that sort of recognition of what stress feels like. So we're going to get geeky. What is it? Like what's going on? It's like what's happening? So you'll probably recognize this as a brain. In fact, it's actually half a brain, cut down the middle. So it's one half of the brain. And deep within the recesses of your brain, there are two important structures. They're actually glands. They're not brain, they're glands. One is called the hypothalamus. You see the arrow pointing to this little structure right here. And the other is the pituitary gland. That's this little structure here. And the role of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are actually to trigger hormones being released throughout the body. And hormones in the body are basically just chemical messengers. They're signals to the body to do things. And there's a whole bunch of them. Some of you probably know about estrogen and progesterone, which are the of our reproductive system, but there's a whole bunch of other hormones that are released in this hypothalamus pituitary gland section of the brain that then flow into the body and cause hormones to be released, and the body functions brilliantly through this. And then they all feed back on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So there's this amazing conversation that's happening between these glands in the brain and the glands in the rest of the body, like the thyroid, like the ovaries, like the adrenals, that are conversing constantly with one another and conversing with the hypothalamus and pituitary. So it's very exquisite and it's amazing how it functions. The other thing that's kind of interesting, I wanted to go back. Let me see, go back. Is that very close by the hypothalamus and pituitary is a section of the brain called the And the limbic system is an area of memory. And it's particularly interesting because it's an area of emotional memory. So it's this place where we store our emotional reactions to things. And I find that really interesting that it's so close to the hypothalamus and pituitary that we would lay down when somebody wrongs us, when something happens to us, when we have a fight with somebody, when we have a really overjoyed moment with somebody, we lay down that emotional content of our memory right close to these glands, which I think is fascinating. The other thing to think about is the structure that's right here is the eye and then the nose. And so those organs, if you had a face here, those sensory organs are right feeding into the structures very close to these glands as well. And so there is a sensory component that's protective when we talk about stress. When we see things, hear things, smell things that trigger that emotional reaction in us and go like, uh-oh, protect yourself. That is by design in the brain, which is really super cool. So here down in the body, so down in the belly, these are your kidneys, right and left kidneys. And sitting on top of the kidneys are these glands called the adrenal glands. And these glands on top of the kidneys are incredible powerhouses of hormones. They secrete estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone in small amounts. They secrete hormones that balance our fluids, blood pressure, our pulse, how much fluid we get rid of in our kidneys, how much salt we retain, all of that sort of blood pressure and heart, pumping, all of that stuff comes from the adrenals. And then there's this layer of the adrenals that actually releases hormones that are involved in stress response. So the stress response can be acute, meaning something just happened to you. And the stress was different than the things that are chronic. So the things that are sort of ongoing and tend to be bothering us for a long period of time release a separate set of hormones. So we'll talk about that. So here's the acute stress. So imagine you're this woman driving her car, and here comes this semi truck right at the front of you. We've all had these experiences, maybe not with a truck, but we've all had those near misses where we've, almost had a head-on collision or a car accident, or somebody runs in front of our car, or somebody, jumps out of a doorway, something that scares us. And when that happens, what is happening in the body is protection, and it's by design. So there's a very, very quick response to release hormones called adrenaline and hormone called noradrenaline. We probably all have heard of adrenaline. Noradrenaline is just its sort of twin sister. Adrenaline is released, and we all have experienced adrenaline, about butterflies in the stomach, fight or flight response, muscles tighten, eyes dilate, maybe you start to sweat. This is protection. So if you were in that car and that truck was coming at you head on, adrenaline being released quickly from the adrenal glands is protective, because you would grip the steering wheel, your pupils would dilate so that you could take in the situation, and you learn to very quickly maneuver out of the way. Back in the very early times of human beings, this is what got us out of being lunch for the saber-toothed tiger. We would turn and run in the opposite direction. All of our blood flow would go to our muscles, and we would get the heck out of there. That's the protective measures that we have with adrenaline. This is life-saving. It is built into every single one of us, and it is an incredibly important system to work correctly. But what about this woman? So probably many of people can relate to this woman, even if you don't have all of these items, you're not doing the kids, but you're doing money, you have exercise, you have work, you have your own medical problems, you have the medical problems of people you care for. You have so many demands on your life, and this is the day in and day out reality for most of us. Now, not all days are like this, but we all have the pings and the dings and the demands and the calls and stuff that takes us off our course every single day that we have to react to. So what is happening with this poor woman? It's not protection, it's actually life. Life happens to us every single day. And what does that translate into in terms of our stress function? What actually comes out in this case is a hormone called cortisol. And some of you may have heard of cortisol before. Cortisol is an incredibly important hormone. It's protective. People always think of it maybe in a negative way, but it's actually, its job is to decrease inflammation in the body. So if you happen to have been hit by that truck in your car, you release to try to help you survive. And if you're injured, you release cortisol to help you quickly mend wounds. That's the job of cortisol. But in life, what ends up happening is cortisol can be called on too much in the day in, day out life that we're trying to lead. It can overwhelm our system, and it can become very taxing to this poor little adrenal gland to try to deal with the demands of cortisol. So those are the really important stress hormones I wanted to go over. So I want to do a little experiment, what I like to call the experiment with lemons, because I want you to understand our role in filtering stress. Now, you don't filter your fight or flight, that happens automatically, but you do filter a lot of the way that you look at the world through your eyes, ears, and nose, and what that can actually do in terms of your cortisol. So I like to do this experiment with lemons. So what I would ask you to do is just close your eyes briefly. And I want you to imagine that in front of you, you have a cutting board and a knife, and you have a beautiful lemon that you've just picked. And you bring the lemon up to your nose and you smell it. You take a deep breath and you smell the essence of the lemon. You can smell that lemony smell. And then you put it down on your cutting board and cut it in half. And you see the juices flow out of the lemon onto the cutting board. And you touch the juices and you put that on your tongue and you taste that very bitter taste, that lemony taste that comes from the lemon. And hold the half cut lemon up to your nose and take a deep breath and smell that lemon smell. Okay, so now open your eyes. And I'm guessing that the majority of people who went through that experiment, it doesn't happen to everyone, but most of us have mouth watering when we do that. And what's interesting to me about that experiment is that with our own minds, we can cause physiological changes in the body. So even though I know none in front of you because I'm looking at you and none of you are cutting a lemon, in your own mind, you can trigger the same type of physiological reactions in the body as if you really did have a lemon in front of you. So I do this experiment to point out that our interpretation of our stress and the way that we look at our stress and manage our stress and think about our stress really does on our body's function and contributes to our release of cortisol. So we can start to become editors of our thinking as a way of self-protection. I think that's a really important thing for us to understand, is that we do have some control over our view of stress. So we talked a little bit at the beginning of the talk about the physical symptoms of stress, and some of these are very obvious, but maybe not all of them. So stress can cause extreme fatigue for people, and that is a reason why a lot of people go see the doctor, is that they're feeling stressed and fatigued. And oftentimes that is not something that in the office visit because it's too short and the list of potential causes is too long, and you'll see your doctor start to get a little panicked. But stress directly can cause fatigue because of that adrenal cortisol response, and we're going to go over that a little bit more. Eating caffeine excessively or stimulants to do anything, sleep issues, and the classic description that I get when people have stress-related symptoms is they feel very tired and exhausted, but they're wired and they can't go to sleep. So that tired and wired feeling. Loss and weight gain are possible. Hair loss can happen with stress. Digestive issues, excuse me, both constipation, diarrhea, or loose stools, or a combination of both, might get chalked up to irritable bowel syndrome, which is just a label of dysfunction of how the bowel works, but can be directly related to stress. An increased sensation of pain. So if you have pain, if you have headaches, for example, migraines, or you have arthritis, or you have other pain issues, stress can exacerbate the pain, flooding the body with cortisol, which to work not as an anti-inflammatory, but a pro-inflammatory. If you have headaches, either tension, migraines, or other, you can see an increase in headaches and menstrual irregularities of all kinds because of the fact that these stress hormones with our estrogen and progesterone, they directly cause problems with those hormones and can disrupt menstruation, can cut it off completely, can make it your bleeding irregular, can cause your period to become very haphazard, heavy, all kinds of issues. And then secondarily, weight loss and weight gain can cause menstrual irregularities as well. So it's kind of the double whammy. From an emotional standpoint, I think, again, a lot of people can relate to feeling stressed and what that feels like as emotions, but it is directly tied to hormones in the body, irritability or feeling angry all the time, depression, anxiety or panic or both, That martyr behavior. This is my classic go-to when I'm stressed. I start to become that person that says like, well, nobody else can do it as good as I can. I'm just going to do it myself, and everyone else can just F off. So that is one of the behaviors I think a lot of us go to when we feel like we're up against the wall, is to take on everything ourselves and overwork and not ask for help. Especially as women, we don't ask for help enough. Being distracted, so I get a lot of people who come and say, I think I have ADHD. I can't focus. I can't do anything. Addiction. So, of all types, becoming more, loosening your habits around alcohol or drugs or food or porn or gambling or TV or any of the things that we use to try to distract ourselves. Those kind of things can go up in stress. Binge eating and stress eating are super common. Problems, loss of libido, loss of orgasm, those are stress problems, and they're really by design. When we're stressed, Mother Nature doesn't want us procreating and making more people to take care of, so we tend to shut down during those times. So it's kind of a natural response, but it can be a sign of stress, can be a sign of adrenal problems, and I think people don't necessarily make that connection. So how does stress affect your health? So we talked about those hypothalamus and pituitary glands and the fact that they release these hormones, which then go over to the adrenals and actually start to cause cortisol production. And when we really put a lot of demand on them, they literally start to fizzle. We can see cortisol production that's increased, off the charts, decreased, or both, leading to those physical and emotional symptoms that we just went through. And how does this affect your health? So the hormones ultimately leading to cortisol irregularities began to manifest in the body, in many of us, as increased belly fat. People develop an increase in their waist, where all of a sudden they're like, I didn't used to gain weight in my belly. I used to just gain it in my legs or my thighs. But now all of a sudden I've got that I don't understand why I have. And when you found fat in your belly, it actually ends up acting as its own hormone producer and starts to cause problems with inflammation and insulin and blood sugar. And pretty soon we're eating because our blood sugar is all over the place. There's something like 30 or 35 hormones that are produced specifically by belly fat. It has its own mechanism for wreaking havoc on the metabolic system. So it's a really significant problem because, as you know, there's a lot of issues in our country, I would say worldwide, are related to obesity, related to insulin, diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. And so managing stress is really an important piece to managing a lot of the things that are going haywire in the body. But that's not all it causes. It also causes problems with other hormone producing glands like the thyroid. Thyroid is a really common issue, especially for women, hypothyroid, low functioning thyroid. The dance between the hypothalamus, pituitary, cortisol, and thyroid is well understood. And so when we look at thyroid in our practice, we are always looking for cortisol and trying to understand where the cortisol is, because if we don't address that, we don't do a very good job of getting a person's thyroid fixed. It also affects our ovaries and our reproductive system, our ovulation. It affects us in perimenopause and menopause. And so it is a really important thing to get on top of as we're entering into those phases where we're changing either from regular menstruation to perimenopause and into menopause, because it just amplifies the symptoms and problems that people have as they're going through those times. So how do we talk about measuring adrenals and measuring cortisol? Because it can be measured, and this can be really, really helpful, because I think a lot of people feel stressed and they feel like their stress is causing physical or emotional problems, but there's no real quote unquote test for it. Well, actually there is. We can measure saliva cortisol through your spit into tubes. We collect it at 4 different times of the day, essentially first thing in the morning, midday, end of the day, and then right before bedtime. And we can plot out this, what's called the diurnal cortisol. It starts off high at the beginning of the, sort of peaks at like 3 a.m., highest at about 7, comes down at noon, and then continues to drop throughout the rest of the days. And then if we follow this out another 24 hours, it would be another roller coaster up and down. So it's the adrenals sort of flexing their power, making sure that they can work if they're on demand. It also helps us to wake up in the morning when our cortisol is higher and go to bed at night when our cortisol is lower. So that can be a cause of insomnia if this is high, or fatigue if. So we can measure that. So let me show you a couple of patterns of what it could look like. This is a stage 1 adrenal fatigue. This is someone who's waking up with a high cortisol value, waking up with a pounding heart, feeling anxious right away in the morning. feels like they might be coming out of a nightmare. They're so amped up when they are waking up from sleep. They feel extremely tired because they feel like they tossed and turned all night. Because their cortisol is high, they're gaining weight, and they're really having a hard time focusing because their sleep is so bad. So we call that a stage 1 adrenal fatigue. Stage 2 looks like of a borderline high, but also lows, kind of all over the. Instead of going nicely down this green patch, we're seeing highs and lows all over the place. Again, anxiety is there, feeling tired and wired, weight gain, irritable, and then that sort of midday slump. You eat lunch and you feel like you just need a siesta really bad. That can be a sign of that midday cortisol drop. It could be causes from other, reasons, like some eating poor food at lunch, eating too much sugar, et cetera. But this is one of the possibilities. And then stage 3, which is really a doozy, and I've seen these in my practice, where people have low cortisol throughout the entire day. I mean, this one's not even on the chart for 3 of them, and then this last one finally kind of crawls in. These are people who are deeply exhausted. A lot of people would say, I think I have chronic fatigue syndrome. They can't exercise. They are depressed. They are just so depleted that they're almost unfunctional. They can't go to work. They can't do what they need to do. And their adrenal function is pretty significantly burned out. And when we're addressing adrenals, we're trying to keep people from getting to this stage. This is just a really hard problem to deal with, both patient's experience of it as well as practitioner, because it's really hard. It's not impossible, but it's really hard to fix this in any short period of time. So what do we do? I'm just going to throw this in really quickly as just to orient you. There are treatments to help suppress, to help support your adrenals and help with stress. These are herbs that have been used by indigenous people throughout the world for millennia. It's interesting that they're all kind of rooty and barky looking. And this is not an exhaustive list of them, but we use a lot of it: ashwagandha, panax ginseng, rhodiola, and licorice root, in addition to supplements that you probably recognize: vitamins, zinc and copper, other supplements that help with sleep, and sometimes hormonal supplements to help people get their adrenals back on track. And obviously the very important other considerations when we're treating people with this is that we're using lifestyle, that we're emphasizing good sleep habits, we're working on stress, we're figuring out mechanisms to help, and really focusing on nutrition and lifestyle supplements as the mainstay of treatment. And it can be treated and it can be helped, but people, it does take time. It can take upwards of a year sometimes to correct these problems. Okay, so now that you're officially geeky and you've got all the science down, you understand how it works, you can read the lab results, you know about the stages of adrenal fatigue, you know what the hypothalamus is. Let's talk about what we can do to help ourselves and keep ourselves physically and emotionally well, especially when things are really rough and your adrenals are taking a significant beating. The first thing to do is to actually make self-care a priority. This is tough for us, I think, as women particularly, because we have so many demands on us, and we tend to put ourselves last in the equation. So if we're taking care of children, we're taking care of aging parents, we're taking care of coworkers, we're taking care of a lot of people in our circle, what we tend to do is just push through and not necessarily say, like, well, where am I on the list? And so when I see patients and I ask women, okay, so I heard you're taking care of all of these things, where are you on the list? What oftentimes happens is women just start to cry because they can feel the pressure, but they just don't know how to possibly put themselves on the list, how to make themselves a priority. So if this means that you need to actually put something on your calendar, or you need to give yourself a reminder, or you need to partner with somebody close to you to remind each other to take care of yourself and make it a priority, not just continue to push forward with your forehead against the wall. Making it a priority is one of the things you just have to decide to do. The second thing is, again, I'm trying to keep these really simple because I know we're all busy and I don't want to ask you to do more. But one of my best friends from middle school, who's still a close friend of mine all these decades later, she's a yoga teacher, and she's given me a card. It's here on my desk. I shall show it to you. And it is this idea of just 3 breaths. When we feel stressed, when we feel overwhelmed, when we feel like we're just going to effing lose it, we can stop and just take 3 breaths. And while we're taking the breath, we say inhaling and exhaling to ourselves. And when we're doing that, we simply cannot think of other things. So it clears our mind, it suppresses our cortisol production, it enhances our sympathetic nervous system, which is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that helps us relax. And it decreases the sympathetic, which is the one that makes you feel like you had 5 cups of espresso. So just 3 simple, deep breaths in a row, which takes all of 10 seconds, can reset all of those things. And the nice thing is this goes with you anywhere, in your car, in the line at the grocery store, with your kids, with your mother-in-law. It's a portable technique that you can use to just reset your system. And you can do it as many times as you like. No limit. And then the last one is at least once daily. So what do I mean by indulgence? Well, I don't think we're nice enough to ourselves personally. So I like to say, pick whatever you like. And I'm going to put the small caveat, as long as I'm not going to say go enjoy crystal meth, because obviously that's not what I would recommend. But if something like a bath or reading or talking on the phone to your friend who makes you laugh off, or having sex or masturbating or taking a walk or just putting your face in the sunshine or whatever, a chocolate, having a chocolate, a glass of wine, one indulgence daily, so that you feel like you are getting your reward. You are getting something from your day that makes you feel like you deserve it. Goes a long way to decreasing cortisol and actually increases dopamine, the reward chemical in our body that makes us feel good. So this doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be excessive. Just take the time to at least one indulgence every day. Goes a long way. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions or feedback.
Great. We do have some questions as my dog comes in to stress me out.
Hi, dog.
She got kicked out again. So first question, they say, I've been noticing that at about 8 p.m. nightly, I need a nap, which usually lasts about 20 to 40 minutes. Are there supplements that could help overcome that in the evening so I can make it to bedtime and not screw up my sleep schedule more?
Oh boy. I would not want you to be taking supplements at bedtime at that time to try to wake you up for a few hours, because that could backfire. My thought to that person would be looking at sleep patterns. Perhaps that is somebody who is sleeping too long at night, getting up too early. So if they're a person who has to get up at 5, for example, to get to work, by 8 p.m., that's a long day, and you're tired at 8 p.m. And I would suggest maybe you actually start your wind down and go to bed. Like, go to bed at 9 o'clock. Start your wind down. Go take a Epsom salt bath. Go take a shower. Drink some chamomile. Go to bed. The supplements that we would look at in terms of preventing that nighttime fatigue, we would really want to unpack the adrenals and understand where the cortisol abnormalities are, so that we could put the correct adaptogen in. They have different effects. Ashwagandha is different from rhodiola, which is different from L-theanine. So we would want to plug those, if this is an adrenal fatigue problem, we would want to plug those adaptogens in at the right times to support the cortisol across that entire diurnal rhythm. So it's a fairly complex answer to a fairly complex problem, but it involves looking at both lifestyle as well as what's happening in the adrenals to be able to fully understand.
Great, thank you. Next question, does cortisol help fight off viruses?
It depends. So if cortisol is being manufactured by the adrenals appropriately, yes, its effect is anti-inflammatory. Its effect is to actually enhance immune function. So release those white cells into the system that'll clobber that virus. However, if cortisol is too high or too low, it has the exact opposite response. So it'll suppress immune function. It'll increase blood sugar in the system, which also has a secondary immune suppression function. It'll make the host, the virus host, us, more susceptible to illness, feel more run down, and have a more prolonged illness if that virus actually ends up setting up shop. So the way that we're designed is cortisol should help. But in our modern world, with all that we have going on, unfortunately, a lot of times our exuberant cortisol response gets in our way of our health and causes us to feel to actually be more susceptible to illness.
Mm. Um, does stress, this is a question for me, but I don't know if this is possible, but does stress build up in terms of like, you know, how we talk about with sleep, we say, okay, you can't, if you have sleep deficit, you can't really bank sleep and build that back up. Does
Yeah.
stress operate similarly, or can stress compound before it, you know, really has an impact on your body? How does that work?
Yeah, I think it's both. So the stressors that we experience, as we talked about earlier in the presentation, they can be those acute stressors, the fight or flight response ones. And those tend to, in most people, come into the system quickly and leave the system quickly. Now, there's some caveats to that, and that is that there are people who are poor metabolizers of adrenaline. So when adrenaline hits the body, the enzymes that you need to break down and get rid of it can be impacted by genetics, and we can measure that. So that enzyme can be different in different people. And so sometimes when people have a fight or flight response or an adrenaline response, they actually carry that adrenaline in their system longer than other people. And those are the people that are really anxious. They have a hard time, they have panic attacks, they have a really hard time getting their arms around that anxiety. I can almost predict those genetics when I meet people and they tell me their story. Cortisol, however, um, if you put a demand on the adrenal glands for cortisol over and over and over and over again, or if you go through a particularly prolonged stressor, for example, a slow death of a loved one, for example, or a divorce, or something that is just really long, painful process, the continuous demand for cortisol on the adrenals can compound day after day after day, and you end up looking like various worsening stages of adrenal fatigue. So that stage 3, where I showed you all the cortisol levels were just flatlined across the bottom, that did not just happen the day before.
Mm-hmm.
That was an accumulation of stressful events or stressful response to events, whether they're real or in our heads, that person had that led them to a cumulative effect on their adrenals. So yes, you can accumulate stress. You can build stressful layers on top of stressful layers on top of stressful layers that are then having that 1-2 punch on the body.
Mm. Can you, kind of as a sub question to that, can you talk a little bit about resiliency and stress? So you're talking about the genetic, you know, your sort of predisposition to be able to process things, but can you speak a little bit to resiliency and where that plays in all of this?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when I start telling people about their cortisol, when I see the results, a lot of people immediately jump to, if their adrenals are impacted by stress, I think a lot of them jump to immediately like, oh, I must not be a very resilient person. I must be kind of weak, right? So no, there isn't a direct correlation between people who are resilient and people who have adrenal fatigue, because there's so many factors that go into people's building of resilience. So the enzyme that I was talking about earlier that is responsible for breaking down adrenaline in the body, that enzyme is called COMT, co-methyltransferase. And COMT is a genetic, as are all enzymes, genetically coded, such that people have changes in that enzyme that render them typically 2 ways. One group will become worriers, and the other group will become warriors. And it's very interesting to see how that plays out when you look at genetics, because there are people who will take things and ruminate and ruminate and ruminate, and they tend to not have as much resiliency. They get really caught up on their record player. And then there are other people who are just, much more sort of go forward, it doesn't bother me. So it's in the genes to a certain extent, but it's also taught, right? I mean, we observe our parents, we observe people who raise, and we could look at them and their coping skills and say like, oh, okay, here's how they manage these things. And we learn by observation. And some of us build resiliency because we actually had somebody demonstrate it for us. And then lastly, our own life experiences give us opportunities to become resilient. So if we've had particularly hard times, we have an opportunity to flex that resiliency muscle a little bit versus people who maybe had less stressors throughout their lives. And so when they encounter something that's stressful, they just don't have the experience to put it into perspective, like this is a really terrible thing or this is not such a terrible thing. So there's a lot of factors involved in that.
Great. At what point with some of these systems or symptoms do you encourage people to talk to their doctor about them? I mean, what is sort of experiencing life and the stress of life, and what is like, no, you should really talk to someone?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's just important to be educated. And so hopefully people will get a sense of what to look for so that it's on their radar. I think that's important because some of us tend to just live with these things and we don't even realize that there's anything going wrong. I think what I always tell people is when it gets to the point where it's getting in the way of your life, that's when I tend to say, like, go get some help, you know? When people have a low couple of months in the middle of winter, if they can function and get out of bed and go to do their work, even if their mood isn't that great, I don't recommend they go on Prozac. You know, it's just too much of a heavy hitting response to a problem that they're managing. But if they're in bed with the covers over their head and they can't take care of their kids and they can't go to work, I mean, that's a different story. And of course, there's a lot of nuance in between. We all have our own personal break. But if it's getting in the way of your function, if it's getting in the way of your productivity, if it's making you irritable and difficult and you're screaming at your kids all the time, even though that's sort of normal. If you are missing deadlines, if you are feeling physically unwell and you can't figure out how to get yourself feeling physically better, yes, bring it up. I would say, though, the unfortunate part is that the traditional medical community denies adrenal fatigue or HPA axis dysregulation. They just don't do a very good job. Most doctors are incredibly friggin' stressed out themselves and not good examples for how to not be stressed. So I really encourage people, whether it's Vital Health or not, find yourself a doctor who understands how to do functional medicine and who can really help you with your lifestyle, because that is the necessary piece.
Great. We've got a couple more minutes here for more questions. So I think we've covered everything in the chat box, but this is your time to submit a few more questions for Dr. Mullen. I feel like there's so much to cover, but I appreciate the kind of narrow, the narrow scope in terms of the cortisol pieces and the, understanding how this all works. So
it's a very complex system and a very complex response. And as I mentioned, that where all our memories are, we all have personalities too, and our response to things varies based on that. So I think that's why personalizing the approach and understanding the approach is obviously my favorite way of going about managing and helping people with this.
Okay, we got a few more in. If you see these things with your life partners and or work partners, are there ways to bring it up without causing confrontation?
Well, yes, I think there are. It depends on the person, obviously. When their eyes are dilated and they're coming at you drooling, that's not the time to do it. When they're in fight or flight response. I think the best way to bring this up is to frame it up, obviously, as, I care about you and I want you to feel good and be well. And then I think sometimes if you could make it a little bit clinical, this is my trick, because if you can speak to it as sometimes this is a problem where your adrenals just don't work as well, feel a little bit less like there's something wrong with you and your irritability starts and you're driving me crazy and this is all your fault. Whereas if it feels like it's more in the body sometimes, and especially, I hate to say this, but especially for men, they can hear that a little bit better. Like, this is a problem that you can fix and maybe you need to check it out. Keeping it very not blaming and not saying you're impossible to be around, but this is a clinical problem and maybe this is something that you could check out. And maybe if you did, you'd feel better. You'd lose that 10 pounds you're complaining about or whatever is the issue. But yeah, I think just keeping it a little bit less emotionally triggering is always a good, safe way to manage that.
Great. Next question. What would you say are some no-brainer first steps to managing the stress? And then are there any books that you'd recommend?
Oh, yes. Okay, so no brainer. Well, in addition to prioritizing oneself, indulging and breathing, I have to say the biggest no-brainer, and this is so biased, so forgive me. I am such a fan of exercise. Um, I feel like especially if you're a woman business owner or you're an executive or even somebody who just is working and being in the world in a big way, being able to channel that stress into a productive physical response can be really, really helpful. It is my secret weapon, 100%. Now, that having been said, if you're feeling really bad with if your body is, you do have significant adrenal fatigue, sometimes going out and hitting it is really, really hard. And so you have to kind of tailor it to what you're able to do physically and with your time. But even things like yoga, you know, more chi, more gentle forms of exercise can be incredibly, incredibly helpful. So for me, that's a no-brainer. The other one is trying to eat healthfully, because when we nourish ourselves, we just feel better. And sometimes that's the hardest decision to make when you're feeling stressed because you want to go for the Cheetos or the wine. At least I do. But if you can counter that with a little bit of nutrition, make yourself a smoothie, you know, counterbalance some, doesn't have to be a masterpiece, Julia Child style thing. It can just be like, take whatever frozen stuff you've got and throw it in a blender with some oat milk and call it a day. At least you're getting some nutrition in your body that you can a little bit better, those really important nutrients that we need to be healthy. And then as far as books, one of my favorite books about, if you're interested in the stress response, is a book called, I don't remember the author, but it's a book called Why Zebras Don't Have Ulcers.
Mm.
It's a really great book about, you know, why we need to move and why we need to recognize our stress patterns in order to be healthy. Talks a lot about the immune system in response to stress. So it's pretty fun. It's a pretty fun read. But there's a lot of great books. You know, I love to recommend Eckhart Tolle, who's a writer who talks about being in the moment. He has a book called, I think, Being in the Now or In the Now or something, I can't remember. Very transformative books about understanding our own self-talk and the fact that we are not our thoughts. We are the observer of our thoughts, which is a really like, that's a huge paradigm shift. That was a huge paradigm shift for me. It's like, if I can see myself thinking, I must be above the thinking, you know? So I
Mm-hmm.
think that that is a really, and it's easy reads, but really transformative ways of understanding how our mind works and how we can become better at, you know, helping ourselves with our thought
Mm-hmm.
patterns.
That's good. Okay, last question here. Can you talk more about how the supplements work differently with cortisol, and what does a treatment plan, in quotes, look like?
Sure. So the different supplements have different impacts on the adrenals. So some of them, well, for example, L-theanine and to a certain extent rhodiola, will help decrease cortisol values. They help the cortisol, too high cortisol, come down. Things like ashwagandha and Panax ginseng help the, which are very, when the adrenals are low functioning and cortisol is low, help that come up. So I oftentimes will identify where the patterns are and then use different adaptogen herbs and supplements to bring cortisol down where it's high, bring cortisol up when it's low, different times of the day. And that's very personalized depending on people's cortisol and, you know, what they eat and how they live and so on. Um, and then the other part of the plan is working through lifestyle. So teaching people how to breathe, teaching people how to recognize where their thoughts are off the rails and it's causing physiological response. So the lemon experiment that we did, helping them recognize their own involvement in their stress response, and then working on getting good sleep hygiene, using sleep supplements if we need to get you there, working on slow return to exercise or different types of exercise patterns that help support the cortisol response and increase energy, help you sleep, and then working on specific nutrients and nutrition to help the body heal and help the health and the immune system and the endocrine, the hormone system work better and be healthier. So it's a full, it's a 360. It's, you know, all of the things that we need to focus on. And then I alluded to earlier, sometimes we'll get into genomics. We'll start on We'll start looking at neurotransmitters. We'll start looking at gut health. It just depends on the person, but there are a lot of things. People have accumulated a lot of problems typically by the time this happens, and really unpacking those individually is very personalized.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all of this. This is just such an incredible wealth of information, I think, for all of us to process.